I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. So I thought I'd start today's talk by reading a small part of an essay written by E.B. White. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with E.B. White. He was a very prolific journalist in the early 20th century. He also was an essayist and wrote some novels. I would say probably the one that people know the most is the book that he wrote called Charlotte's Web. A lot of people know that story. It was also made into a very cute cartoon. There's been a live action movie, sort of. A lot of it's CG. But, you know, it's one of those books where I think a lot of kids reading it, that was their first introduction to, let's say, mortality. You know, in Charlotte's Web, the spider Charlotte uses her very short time alive to help save a pig from being slaughtered, which she does successfully. Wilbur is saved, but then Wilbur has to say goodbye to his friend who dies. And so it's one of those interesting stories that you don't expect to be for children, and yet it is, and it touches on some really serious stuff. And, you know, I tend to bring up a lot of these things, you know, like I bring up Mr. Rogers a lot, because he was one of those people that wasn't afraid to talk about really tough subjects to children. And it turns out E.B. White was also not shy about that either, writing Charlotte's Web and other things like that. But I've been reading E.B. White's essays for a while now, and you know, I hate to admit this, given that a lot of people know me as the scholarly type, but I'm actually a very slow reader. I think I've been working on this book of essays for probably about a year or so. But he's just such a fascinating guy, E.B. White. You know, he, much like me, was very introverted, but perhaps to a degree I've never even experienced. I read stories where when he was a journalist in New York, and remember that he's really well known, he publishes all this great work, he's not just a journalist, but an essayist, a novelist. People would come by the office to well wish him and say things and want to offer him, you know, lunch and whatever. And what he would do is anytime he found out he had a guest who wanted to visit him in the office, he would escape through the fire escape in New York, which I can only imagine. Like, you know, here's a photo of this guy, this amazing man, and anytime someone just came out of the blue just to say hi, like, I love your work, and well, where is he? He just stepped out. He stepped out the fire escape. And I'm pretty introverted myself, but I can't even imagine ever doing something like that. But in any case, I've been reading this book for a while, and I came across a passage I thought was interesting because it's probably the closest I've ever seen a non-Buddhist to having an experience of samvega, that sense of dread and dismay over the condition that sentient beings find themselves in samsara. And he gets like really close, but not quite there. And so I thought I'd share it just to see if you also might see it that way as well. And so in this essay, I think he's writing this, it's something that happened around 1956 or so, and he and some friends are in Florida, and they were at a circus, and they'd just seen this big lion show with like the whole whip and everything, and it was all very titillating because the lion tamer managed to get the whip wound around one of the lion's toes, and so there's this like moment of panic, and he's like, well, I feel like we got our money's worth. That was pretty scary. But now the show's over, and some of the circus people are practicing other stuff as they're leaving, E.B. White and his friends. And it's as they're leaving that they manage to catch this older woman. He says she's about in her 40s or so, and she's walking this horse around a circle right there in the arena of the circus. And a younger woman, maybe around 17 or 18, is practicing all these amazing tricks on the back of the horse. And so it's as he's seeing that he has this reflection that I wanted to share with everyone. And so he says, as I watched with the others, our jaws a droop, our eyes alight, I became painfully conscious of the element of time. Everything in the hideous old building seemed to take the shape of a circle, conforming to the course of the horse. The rider's gaze, as she peered straight ahead, seemed to be circular, as though bent by force of circumstance. Then time itself began running in circles, and so the beginning was where the end was, and the two were the same. And one thing ran into the next, and time went round and around and got nowhere. The girl wasn't so young that she did not know the delicious satisfaction of having a perfectly behaved body, and the fun of using it to do a trick most people can't do. But she was too young to know that time does not really move in a circle at all. I thought, she will never be as beautiful as this again, a thought that made me acutely unhappy. And in a flash, my mind, which is too much of a busybody to suit me, had projected her 25 years ahead, and she was now in the center of the ring, on foot, wearing a conical hat and high-heeled shoes, the image of the older woman, holding the long rein, caught in the treadmill of an afternoon long in the future. She is at that enviable moment in life, I thought, when she believes she can go once around the ring, make one complete circuit, and at the end be exactly the same age as at the start. Everything in her movement, her expression, told you that for her the ring of time was perfectly formed, changeless, predictable, without beginning or end, like the ring in which she was traveling at this moment, with the horse that wallowed under her. And then I slipped back into my trance, and time was circular again, time pausing quietly with the rest of us, so as not to disturb the balance of a performer. Her ride ended as casually as it had begun. The older woman stopped the horse, and the girl slid to the ground. As she walked towards us to leave, there was a quick, small burst of applause. She smiled broadly, in surprise and pleasure. Then her face suddenly regained its gravity, and she disappeared through the door. It has been ambitious and plucky of me to attempt to describe what is indescribable, and I have failed, as I knew I would. I think he was almost there, man. Like he managed to get onto the age part. All he needed was sickness and death, and he would have had it. He would have understood. You know, in some ways it reminds me of, you know, that one quote from Heraclitus that people only get part way. You know, you can't step in the same river twice, I think is how most people say it these days, right? And, you know, the full quote is that, you know, no one can step in a man can't step in the same river because, you know, neither he nor the river are the same, right? And so for Heraclitus, things are in constant flux, constant change. From a Buddhist perspective, this circle of time is quite different. We talk about samsara, but you know, we also have samsara chakra, which is like the wheel of samsara, which is not necessarily timeless. It's certainly not the qualities that he described as like perfect and all this stuff, the way he imagined this girl must see herself as someone young. Because like it is quite common for young people to think they're invincible, that they don't age, they won't get old, they won't get sick, they won't get die, they feel invincible. And so they do crazy things like this, like the people that, you know, climb mountains without any gear, that decide to tightrope walk between skyscrapers and jump out of airplanes and do all this reckless stuff because they feel invincible, right? But like he noticed, you know, this girl won't be the same by the time she completes the circle. She will have been now older. Every moment we're marching towards our last day. We just don't know when that day is. And so it's an interesting thing that he almost gets there. It almost feels like samvega, that sense of like, oh no, this is a bad thing that we're in. Samsara is not where we want to be. We do want to escape. He gets kind of there. But it's interesting that he envisions this as a circle. You know, I was reflecting on this, not because of samvega, although I did bring it up, and it is important for Buddhists to keep in mind, but because lately I've been thinking about what we often translate as dependent co-arising or dependent origination. In Pali, it's paticcasamuppada. And it's one of those things that because of the way it's structured, we tend to think of that as a circle as well. Now, this is where we start getting into the stuff that people tend to think is very complex and very heady and very philosophical because it has all these things that are connected. And so I will go through them just so that you know what they are. But my hope is by the end of the talk, I have demystified it in some way. Not that paticcasamuppada, dependent co-arising, isn't complex. It is, but it's complex for different reasons other than being a complex philosophy. In fact, the Buddha himself makes a point about this. It's quite a famous thing that makes it around in Buddhist circles. Ananda, silly little dimwit he can be sometimes in the Pali Canon, unfortunately, is talking about paticcasamuppada to the Buddha. And he says, wow, it's amazing how this thing seems really complex, but it's actually quite clear, isn't it? And the Buddha looks at him and he says, no, it isn't. It's very complex. It's a big knotted mess. What are you talking about? It's one of those stories. There's always those examples. Poor Ananda, he gets picked on so much in the canon. It must be really tough to just be a guy with a great memory, but otherwise quite unremarkable, and then be the Buddha's attendant. And so he was constantly being compared. I feel bad for Ananda. He's always not necessarily the butt of jokes, but there's always something he hasn't quite grasped, and the Buddha has to point it out, or Sariputta has to point it out, or some other more advanced bhikkhu has to point it out to him. But he gets there eventually. In the canon, he eventually becomes a full arahant, and he gets to show them. But in any case, in that story, it's revealed that, no, this is complex, but not complex in the way we might think. These days, paticcasamuppada, when it's introduced as very heady. This is a very abhidharmic, it's very this, it's very that. It's this stuff for really advanced people, and it's not quite that. But I'll lay the framework this way. In the canon, paticcasamuppada is usually brought up when someone comes to the Buddha and wants him to make any claims on identity. I am or I am not. In other words, self or not self or no self, things like that. And he often says that the claims that people make in regard to self are entirely missing the mark. And so he seeks out to establish the middle way. And he says, we're going to avoid claims of I am, we're going to avoid claims of I am not, claims of existence and non-existence, and he'll cut through the middle. And in the canon, we find different iterations of paticcasamuppada, or dependent co-arising, but I'll go with the more familiar one, the one we most come across, which begins with ignorance. And so it's stated that ignorance is a requisite condition for fabrication, sankhara, and fabrication is a requisite condition for consciousness, and consciousness is a requisite condition for name and form, and name and form is a requisite condition for, name and form, sense bases, so, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, mind, all that stuff. From sense bases as a requisite condition, we have contact. And from contact as a condition, we have feeling. And from feeling, craving, and then clinging, and then birth, and then becoming, and lastly, aging and death. And so you can see when it's laid out that way, people try to grasp it, they try to remember all the different things, and they tend to sometimes think of it as kind of a circle. Except this time, because there's 12 of them, it lines up quite neatly in our Western minds. It's like a clock. If ignorance is 12 o'clock, then contact is 6 o'clock, and so on. And because they're causally related, people then want to try to understand it. And so there's all these complex ways they talk about ignorance. Ignorance in terms of the Four Noble Truths, fabrication in terms of bodily fabrication, verbal fabrication, mental fabrication, and so on, and so on, and so on. And they break it up in all kinds of ways. And there's this tendency to think that this causal flow only goes in one direction, like time, the way we read it on a clock. It's 1 o'clock, then it's 2 o'clock, then it's 3 o'clock, and so on. Ignoring those parts in the canon where paticcasamuppada can be looked at in many ways. There's a reason why we call it dependent co-arising, is that these are all things that are happening at the same time, observable at the same time, but also things that are not nearly as complex as they seem at the get-go. Now I'm going to try to avoid the mistake that Ananda made. The philosophical side of it is not complex. The reason why it is complex is because this is a philosophical framework, a system for understanding the mind, understanding the heart. And it's the mind that is complex, the heart that is complex. It's the heart that's all tied up in knots. And so any system that means to describe it will itself also seem, at first glance, to also be tied up in knots. So we have this whole system I've laid out. I've gone through all of them, and I can even go through all of them in Pali too. Talk about avijja, sankhara, vijnana, and so on, right? Nama, rupa, and all that. But it's just, we have the English terms. The English terms are good enough to grasp. And when we start picking them apart, we see that all these different things we're looking at are related to what's happening in our direct experience. This is what I actually really enjoy about Buddhism as a religion, Buddhism as a path, Buddhism as a way of life, is that we have all these seemingly complex philosophies that people tend to hold on to and grasp as concepts. People love talking about dependent co-arising. They love it, especially in medieval Buddhism. Nagarjuna talks a lot about dependent co-arising, and how it relates to emptiness and so on. And even today, a lot of Buddhist scholars love to make it seem so complex, so philosophical. And when it comes to this whole process of I making, my making, me, and all this stuff, all this ideas that we build up around identity and self and no selves and not selves, it can end up becoming more an issue of debate, more an issue of views, which is so funny to me, the irony of that, because we're then getting back into a thicket of views, getting caught up into the kind of stuff that the Buddha proposed this as a remedy to. Rather than getting caught up in a lot of philosophical debate, rather than getting caught up in metaphysical debates about what is and is not, instead take things back to your own direct experience, what you see in your body and mind, and view them instead of in terms of I, look at them as processes. And so in Buddhism, we often talk about what we call the five heaps or the five aggregates. We talk about form, we talk about feeling, we talk about perception, we talk about fabrication, we talk about consciousness. And you'll notice that a lot of the things I just described in these heaps, in these aggregates, are exactly what's described in the first half of paticcasamuppada. We have consciousness, well actually after ignorance we have fabrication, then we have consciousness, then we have nama rupa, which is just another way of saying name and form, which is just another way of saying the aggregates, even though some people like to debate that it means other stuff like intention, attention, contact, but then we have contact in the list too. So we find all of these various ways of saying the exact same thing. What's happening in the body, what's happening in the mind, what's happening in the heart. Fabrication, consciousness, name and form, sense media, as in the senses, the sense bases, contact, feeling, all of that leads up to craving. And in this system, the Buddha often says that in everything leading up to clinging, if you manage to break the cycle at all in those first 5 or so, just take one of those pins out, the whole thing becomes unraveled. It's once we get to clinging that's a little more murky. Because once clinging is happening, then we have that as a cause for being born, so birth, and then becoming, and then old age and death. So if I can demystify it, what this means is that this whole system that seems very complex is coming to what we experience right here in the present moment. This got brought up because, lately I've been leading meditation more often. People are coming here to the temple now to meditate more, which is a very good thing. I have to tell you, a few years ago, because of the pandemic, I didn't think there'd be people here again at all. Oftentimes it was just the monks and me and our Zen teachers as well, and the camera, and we didn't know who was watching. We'd watch the video later on Zoom or YouTube. There wouldn't be any comments. So now we have people here at the temple again, and it's very good to see people here. And now people are coming for meditation. And people come in with all kinds of experiences, all kinds of knowledge, because they've often studied with other teachers, they've studied other Buddhist traditions, They learn all these things from like Burmese teachers and Thai teachers and everything. And we live in a time when we have so much Buddhist thought. We have 2,600 years of all kinds of philosophy that have been built up. And unfortunately, that is a double-edged sword. I'll put it one way. A while back, I was talking with a group of students of my teacher, and my teacher was also there, and someone brought up some like hoity-toity Buddhist philosophical concept, and it was something that had been said by some very famous Buddhist teacher however many centuries ago. And then my teacher said, okay, well, this person said this, but were they saying it to themselves, or were they saying it in the debate hall? In other words, we have this aspect of Buddhism that existed because people wanted really, really convincing arguments for why Buddhism is superior to other forms of thought, other practices, other kinds of meditation, and so on. And there was a period in Indian philosophy during the medieval period in Indian history that the more complex and hard to grasp something was, the truthier it was, the more real it was. Like, it's complex and you can't understand it, so it's got to be true. That tends to be how a lot of the philosophies went, which is very different from when we go back to the canon and read what's there. Yes, there are long lists. Yes, there are 4 of this, 5 of that, 8 of this, and in this case, with these nidhanas in the paticcasamuppada, there's 12, right? But these 12 often are different ways of getting at the same point. We're doing this practice to understand ourselves. That ignorance that we have is in regard to the Four Noble Truths, and those Four Noble Truths are directly involved with what's happening right here and right now. When we look at the Buddha's own experience of becoming fully liberated, of becoming fully awake, of achieving Nibbana, right? He talks about that process. He talks about it in terms of this, that conditionality. In other words, he had gotten to the point in the practice where he no longer was dealing with I-making and I-making, my-making rather. He had gotten to the point where he was dealing in things, not necessarily in an abstract way, but in a way that was no longer personal. He was looking at things in terms of the phenomena. When there is X, there is Y. When X stops, Y stops. And so he looked at that in terms of his own experience, the way he lays it out in the paticcasamuppada. So take fabrication, for example. Fabrication is how we create. It's our intentions for how we shape our lives. As I said before, there's mental fabrication, various thoughts and perceptions we have. Verbal fabrication, which includes the way we talk to ourselves and the way we talk to others. And bodily fabrication, the things we do with our bodies. And so we're trying to understand how fabrication works. That means we're looking at how it originates, how it fades away. We're looking at the allure, we're looking at the drawbacks, we're looking at the escape, how it is that we break our attachment to that process of fabrication. And so that means that when we look at something in our meditation, when we reflect on what's happening in the mind, we're not just watching the clouds go by. It's one of those things that is difficult to talk about because there are certain Buddhist traditions where they really hammer that point home. They really do believe that meditation is just about watching things happening and not getting involved. Even, I think, either this morning or last night on my Facebook feed, someone shared a quote from a very famous Zen teacher who was saying that Zazen is not a technique. You don't do it to be happy. You don't do it to do this. You don't do it to change your mind. You don't do it for that. You're just watching. You're not you're not getting involved. You're not. And while that's certainly true of their tradition, it's not something we find in the Pali Canon. You are getting involved. It is you changing things, manipulating things, looking at things in different ways, experimenting, playing, truly getting to right understanding. You're combating ignorance and unskillful fabrication. That ends up being exactly the beginnings of the path, right view and right resolve. The more you look at all of these aspects of paticcasamuppada, you see the Eightfold Path itself. You see the Four Noble Truths themselves as something directly experienced, not concepts. The Buddha called those Four Noble Truths noble because they relate to the end of suffering. but they're truths that are true inside your hearts when you look. You look to see suffering, comprehend suffering, abandon the cause of suffering. You realize the end of suffering, and you develop the path that leads to that end. So that knowledge of the Four Noble Truths is something that develops throughout the course of our practice, because it's more than just knowledge, it's directly experienced. If it was just knowledge in the conceptual way, me just telling you that would free you right now. You'd all be awakened just by having that knowledge. But it's not that kind of knowledge. It's direct experience, putting it into practice, these Four Noble Truths, developing the path. And so once you start fabricating, conditioned from right view, conditioned with these Four Noble Truths, that has a ripple effect through the rest of paticcasamuppada. The way you fabricate, meaning what you do in body, speech, and mind, has an effect on your consciousness. And having an effect on your consciousness has an effect on how you relate to your body and your mind, the nama, rupa, name and form. And how you do that affects how you relate to your senses, what you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, what you hear, what you think. And that also has an effect on contact, what you allow in through the senses and what you send outward into the world. That changes your feeling, the feeling tones, what you regard as pleasant, what you regard as unpleasant, what you regard as neither pleasant nor unpleasant. That changes what you crave. Craving in regard to sensuality, craving in regard to becoming, craving in regard to non-becoming. That changes what you cling to. Not clinging to the world in the normal way, the way most people do, but clinging to the path. Clinging to admirable friendship, the people you know on the path who have your best interests in mind. They're striving for their long-term welfare and happiness, desire that for you as well, and are willing to walk alongside you as a fellow traveler so that you do it too. And then from clinging, we see what we give birth to, what arises, what sense of identity exists in a world of experience. What do we give birth to in our hearts, our minds? What kind of further becoming? And in other words, what kind of life do we live? Think in terms of skillful livelihood, which is more than just the job you have. It's how you occupy your time. What do you do day in and day out? That is how you are defined. You're defined by your actions. You're defined by your livelihood. So that becoming is shaped by everything that precedes it as well. And then as we do that, our relationship to the human condition also changes. It changes how we regard this life. It changes how we regard old age, sickness, death. We have a different sense of time and what's important. Things become immediate because we recognize that our free will exists in the present moment. There is no free will in the past. Those actions have already happened. There's no free will in the future because those are often just far-off memories, or rather fantasies. Free will is something that exists in the present moment. So our scope becomes far more immediate. We think about what we're doing, what we're thinking, what we're feeling right here, right now. And so I hope that that goes in the direction of demystifying what some feel is like real deep philosophy. I never thought I'd spend so much of my life studying philosophy just to be like, well, it's a lot of the time just a load of crap, but it kind of is. Because real philosophy always comes back to what is actionable, what you can do right now to actually make your life better. Always regard the path, whatever it is you're studying in regard to Buddhism, as something that can make your life immediately better right here, right now. Because the Buddha says so. He regards the path as good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. Meaning that it is actionable, and what you put into action actively affects yourself and those around you. It improves your life, truthfully, really. And it all comes to how we relate to these concepts. Finding ways to put them into practice, demystifying them so that they feel like something we can actually do. Not the work of great minds, the work of your mind. Not the work of great hearts, the work of your heart. Something that you can do today. Right? So as we reflect on this dependent co-arising, we grow to a better awareness of what interconnectedness is. It's not like those lame jokes. Like, I don't know if anyone ever saw that terrible movie, Bulletproof Monk, but they run with one of those dumb jokes where like a monk goes up to a hot dog stand and he tells the hot dog vendor, make me one with everything, right? And that's as far as interconnectedness goes for a lot of people. It's a punchline, right? Interconnectedness means that what we do affects us and affects others. And the way that we fabricate, the way we create, our intentions shape everything. Think about what the Buddha said at the beginning of the Dhammapada, right? Everything is preceded by the mind. That is in regard to sankharas, fabrications. Mental, verbal, bodily fabrication. So that means that as we practice, we're practicing all the time, but always right now. Think in that scope. And see if you can do it in a way that is, like the Buddha, depersonalized. Don't be so caught up in what's self or not self. A lot of people are always worried about that. I know a lot of Buddhists that are always talking about not self and no self and making all these strong claims. And the Buddha didn't teach that way. He looked at it more as a strategy. You look at what you're clinging to, you look at what you're craving, and you regard it as something you can let go of. That's the true extent of emptiness, and that's the true extent of not self. Recognize what's worth holding on to, and know the time and the season for letting go. That's how we cultivate the path. So those are my thoughts for today. I'm almost halfway through the book. Maybe I'll find something good to say in about 7 or 8 months at this rate. Thank you everyone for listening.